Hello there. My name is Dr. Salim Javed. I am an associate professor at the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at Lingia's Lalita Devi Institute of Management and Sciences. As you know that we have been talking about different story formats, we have explored around 5-6 options of story formats, and if you remember, we have been talking about Denwell's 7 plot point story format. Now, what is so unique about this particular format of Denwell's? If you remember that we have talked about that when 7-point story structure, the unique point about this 7-point story structure is the non-linearity of the steps to be followed. Now, what do we mean by non-linearity? If you remember, when we were talking about Black Snyder breach sheet, there was a chronological order, point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, 4, 15, up till 15. And there is where we were understanding each step in a chronological order. But when I say that 7-point story structure is non-linear, so what does it mean? Does it mean that it is a haphazard order to understand? No, it is also a linear format. Like as you can see on your screen, at point number 1 you have hook, on point number 2 you have plot turn 1, at point 3 you have pinch 1, at point 4 you have midpoint, pinch point 2, plot turn 2 and resolution. This is a chronological order. So as long as we read this 1 to 7, it is a chronological order. But what Denwell says that if you understand the end of your story, then it becomes easy to start your story. Sometimes end becomes the beginning of the story. So the non-linear format which he actually uses, or rather he wants his readers and viewers to understand, that you should start, in terms of writing, you should start your story from resolution and not from the hook. Now, as hook is the first point and resolution is the last point in the chronological order, what makes it non-linear that he asks you to start with resolution, or we can say that he asks you to start with the end of the story. Now, what is the advantage of starting from end of the story? Obviously, you have a certain climax in your mind. You know where your character will be reaching. Now, Denwell says that if you know where your character will be reaching, it is easy to give him a beginning. So that's what he says, that it becomes easy. So when you start with your story with the end, you have the end of the story in your mind, it is easier to give the story a nice beginning in a equilibrium manner, or you can strike a balance between ending and the beginning of the story. Now, it is not only that only you start with the end and then you come to the opening. So then the third thing that he asks you to do is to decide what will be the midpoint of the story. Now, this is something very interesting. We always say, like Aristotelian 3-act story structure, beginning, middle and end. So he says that you should know about the end first. Then the moment you know about the end, it is easy to have a beginning. But between end and beginning, you should know what is the midpoint, how effective the midpoint will be in your story. The moment you decide on these 3 things, end, then beginning and then midpoint, then you should touch plot points and pinch points. Now, plot points, technically we can say plot point 1 or plot point 2, as I have already explained. They are basically the obvious opportunities for your protagonist, and pinch 1 and 2 are basically when the stakes are high. So when you are writing about the opportunities that your character is going to get, in that sense we are talking about plot turn 1 and plot turn 2. And if we are talking about when the stakes are highest, not high, highest, so one is before midpoint and one is after midpoint. So this is how this linear format turns into non-linear format, and that is what makes it unique. Now, according to this formula, to start a story, as I said, that you should know the end of the story. What do you see for your protagonist at the end of the story actually brings very quality changes in your story. Starting at the end gives a clear goal to aim all our efforts. It is a fantastic way to write stories. Now, This was about linearity and non-linearity, and if you remember that I also talked about that Dan Wells basically talked about 5 more elements, of which characters like round, dynamic, flat, static, stock characters we have already discussed. I also talked about why the environment of the story should be rich. Okay, it has nothing to do with the investment point of view. It is not that the rich environment means that it should be a big budget film. Rich environment means that the cinematography of that particular film should be in sync with what the story is trying to say. So that makes it a rich environment. I also talked about it. Then I have been talking about plots and subplots, and I said that at a lot of places we have been reading a lot about subplots, but when somebody asks what a subplot is, when you are asked to define subplot, sometimes it becomes very, very difficult to explain what subplots hit. And I will be explaining that how plots are divided into subplots and how they should be written, or what goes. I'll pick up an example of one of the very famous films, and I will tell you, you may be knowing the plot of that film, but I will break that film into subplots and will explain how things happen on screen and how subplot unfold itself on screen. Then you have Ice Monster Prologue, which is very interesting to know. You have been seeing it, but maybe you have not noticed it. And then we have try fail cycles. Now there is a linearity again even in this list, that he talks about character, then he talks about rich environment, then he talked about plot, subplot, then he talked about Ice Monster Prologue, and then he talks about try and fail cycle. I have explained character and rich environment. In the linear format it should be subplot, but before I explain subplot, I will be explaining about rich monster, about the ice monster and try-fail cycle. But for the sake of understanding, let's understand what rich environment means. Now, don't forget about the setting after spending so much time developing the plot and the character. Now, please take it as a warning in terms of writing. I have been meeting a lot of young aspiring writers, and I have been talking to them, and I also have been working on my own story. That is where they talk a lot about, sir, how should the character be? If I give this attribute to this particular character, will he remain flat, or will he become a round character, or will he or she become a dynamic character? So there has been a lot of discussion about characters. Then there has been a lot of discussion about the costume of that character, the look he or she will be carrying. There has been a lot of discussions about a lot of other things, but what people do not discuss about is the setting, the locale of the story, the mounting of the story, the mise en scène of the story. Now these are the terms that I will be explaining separately, but as you invest yourself in story, as you invest yourself in characters, as you invest yourself in turns and twists, but do not forget to create the world, or do not lose the track of the world in which you are weaving your story. So the environment also plays, or rather it becomes one of the characters of the story itself. And if you remember, in the last video I talked about that how the upcoming film Kalki, the mise-en-scène that has been created, the environment that has been created in that story, if it is not believable, trust me, if it is believable, story will work. If it is not believable, story will not work. Doesn't matter, how big the project is. Now, if I give you an example of Gotham, if I give you an example of Westeros, Hogwarts, Star Wars, go back, watch these 4 films. If you take the environment from these 4 films, or for that matter any Sanjay Leela Bhansali's film, you take the environment out of that film, okay, Parinda for that matter, any Jaane Bhi Do Yaaro for that matter, you take out the environment, trust me, characters will fall flat. That's what I said. it's a word of caution that I'm passing on to you, that if your story, if your characters are not in a world which is believed by the audience, doesn't matter how brilliant that story has turns and twists, the entire film will fall flat. Now these worlds are stunning in their attention to detail. That's what makes them so interesting, so believable. The settings alone make these tales almost worth watching and reading. I'll be talking about watching also and reading also. In Ice Monster, I'll give you an example from a book. Now, as we are talking about Ice Monster, let's talk about Ice Monster prologue. Since most protagonists begin stories at a disadvantage. Now, what does it mean that the most stories starts, at disadvantage? Now, think of Bahubali. Okay. Now, Bahubali is a infant who is dependent. He is just a newborn baby. He and his grandmother is taking care of him. She sacrifices herself while saving him, and then that newborn baby is being taken by a tribe. Now, as long as he is not fully grown up individual, he is absolutely at a disadvantageous position. Now, it also means that when the story starts, your character is a weak link, or rather the weakest link of the story. The chain is as strong as the weakest link. Now the hook sequence tends to be dull. Now if you wait in value, you will understand what does hook sequence tends to be dull means. In most cases, the inciting incident comes after the story has started, but before the conflict has established. Now, inciting incident is one of the points in the story where your character is pushed on the road where you want your protagonist to go. Now, this is something which is like there may be or there may not be a conflict because of which your character has been put on the road, on the map, on the track. Now, in most stories, the first act is dedicated entirely to establish the scene. Now, this is something which I believe in modern days the fault lies, where the fault lies. Audience, after watching such a pacey material on OTT platforms, cannot wait almost for 15 or 20 minutes. They are merciless now because they are in a habit of watching fast-paced stories where a lot of incidents are unfolding one after another. And when you dedicate your entire first act to establish the story, it has observed that a lot of people lose interest in film, be that on OTT or be that in cinema hall. So anything, if you really want your audience to stick to you or your product, you need to have something big to start with. And if you do not believe me, what I have just said, have you not experienced the same thing in the opening sequence of Jawan? Now you love that scene, where he comes, reminiscing, being a mummy, and comes and fights and save the saviors. You suddenly feel, okay, the film has started. Oh, it just started. They are not telling you why he is wounded, why he is carried out to that particular place, why the area is attacked, how come he gains consciousness, why he is so good with instruments, fighting instrument. You do not know anything about it, but there the film starts with a bang and you just love that. So in most stories, when I say in most stories, the first act is entirely dedicated to establish the scene. I think this is one of the first points now for nowadays where writing needs to change. I'll give you one very classic example of this device which Jawan has used. The author's description of the character and their regular lives before the crisis comes up, and then you get into act B. But nobody would so this is how it works. Now if I give you a novel, suppose if I give you a novel, suppose you are my student and I give you a novel, we both of us are in a classroom and I give you a novel to read. And in the beginning, in chapter 1 of that particular novel, it is all about where this village is situated, how far it has been from Delhi, who are the characters, what kind of lives they have been leading, what are the broader issues of this particular area, how our protagonist will eventually be walking in the conflict. Trust me, as a reader, you will lose interest after reading 3-4 pages. And that is what the end of my novel for you. In the same way, that if now onwards, like I have been reading a lot of articles related to what's going wrong with Hindi cinema in terms of writing, and one of the common comment by industries, critiques, even producers, that we do not have good talent and good writers. Now there's nothing wrong with something. There is nothing so dangerous about not having good talent or good writers. But the problem is, a project makes a writer, a project makes an actor. So if you develop a good project, there are good writers, there are good actors, there are good technicians. But how do you make a good project is the challenge. So if somebody asks me, according to me, it is not the responsibility of writers, it is not the responsibility of actors, it is the responsibility of producers. What kind of projects are they backing? Do they have that sort of a vision that by reading script they can visualize, they can weigh how much this script will cost, who are the talent that should be connected to it? Is it the star value that I am connecting with the project, or is it the actors that I am connected with project, or I am using the hybrid model? So it is up to the producer. Producers need to be sensible in terms of good films. When there is a good film, it is always the actor takes the credit, or if the audience is generous enough, they give credit to the creator, they give credit to the writers, but nobody gives credit to the producer. Whereas it is the vision of the producer that is working. Rest are employed individuals. Please understand this. There are contracts involved. I'll be talking about contracts also. But it is who is taking the risk in terms of business is also need to be appreciated. Now, let's talk about in terms of a book. Now, nobody would like to, read all the setups if the story, did not last, or it does not give a hint of eventual excitement. Now, as I said, that if I give you only the background or the setup that I have been talking about, but if I give you only the setup, trust me, as a reader, most of us will not be able to survive 4 or 5 pages. There has to be something exciting, be that language. I'm not against this point. Be that language only. Be that be that the conversation between two characters, but there has to be excitement from the very first scene in terms of cinema and very first line in terms of literature. excitement, which can be intellectual excitement also. It is not that somebody really has to slip over a banana. It is not necessary like that. Excitement, be that intellectual, be that physical, be that moral, anything, but it needs to be excitement. It needs to be exciting. Now, look, please understand, when I pick up a book or when I start reading, when I start watching a film, there are certain expectations which are involved in the process, and that expectation can only be satiated when it is different from normality. Now, if you are traditionally developing the setup that I have been talking about, there is nothing exciting about this development. And within, as I'm saying, that once the reader reads 4-5 pages, he will lose it all. And if you are not, making it exciting in the very beginning of cinema, and I said exciting does need not to be physical. It can be on any level. It can be on social level. It can be exciting on a social level. It can be exciting on a physical level. It can be exciting on an intellectual level. It can be exciting on a spiritual level also. But there has to be excitement. Please understand the psychology. That is what I have been, advocating for a long time. That in terms of cinema, in terms of any creative process, you have invited the audience, or the audience has agreed to come and see your work. It has to be different from what he or she has been experiencing till the time he or she entered or decided to sit down and watch the film. Therefore, authors, writers, producers, directors need something to, pique the interest before delving into the mundane setup details. What I said, I'm not against setup. That is like, this particular element is everywhere. This particular element is in all the story formats. Unique, very, very necessary things. But what I am asking, or what Dan Wells is asking you, to pique the interest. And how do you pique the interest is absolutely individual take. How do you pique the interest of audience or reader is absolutely a personal style. And there is where the prologue, Ice Monster, comes into play. Now, as Dan Wells notes to the opening scene of G.R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, it's a beautiful novel, by referring to this section of the story as the Ice Monster prologue. Martin sets the first chapter of Game of Thrones against the backdrop of a battle between humans and mystical ice monster. Now, this is very interesting. If I tell you that I am going to tell you a story which has got monsters in it, which has got warriors in it, now what do you expect? You expect that the story will start with this only, which is a very natural reaction. Now, if you have seen Game of Thrones, or for that matter, Ramayana is also a beautiful example of this. You know that there is something magical about the story. But do you see that magic from the very starting of the story? No. There is a promise that you will be seeing magic within the story. But that comes when it is necessary as per the requirement. Now, here is where I have seen few projects that because you have understood this particular point, so you need to start your story like this. Imagine that Ramayana is starting with the fight between Ram and Ravana. People will get very excited. But again, simply they will demand why it happened. What was the reason? What was the nature of the events that led to this sort of a climax? Now, there are there is a long setup after the monster encounter where nothing magical happens. Now, if you have seen Game of Thrones, you know, uh, the season 1, episode 1 starts that a lot of people are getting ready and they're going through a cave. Then they cross the wall and there are some dead bodies. The person sees something, reports it back, and gets killed by the end of the story. And a lot of other clans, kingdoms are introduced in between, and what sort of value system they have, that has also been discussed and shared. That you never leave your post. If you leave your post, you will be killed. Doesn't matter whether you are right or wrong. Now, there is no magic battle happening. They are not showing any obvious monster in episode 1 and in season 1 and episode 1. But by the glimpse of what they have shown you, it has sown a seed in your heart that it is a story where a lot of magical creatures will come up. You do not know when, but they are. Now, this is what what's his name? This is what the writer of Game of Thrones, R.R.R. Martin, he says that my job is to take you to a story which has got magical creatures and magical individuals. Yes, that is absolutely right. But I am not giving you all in the first season and first episode. But my job is to let you know that this is something which is promised. Now that is how so this is how the reader can take the Ice Monster prologue as a promise. Now this is something very, very important, as a promise that the story will eventually come to the magic and adventure that it has promised. Now this is what is called Ice Monster prologue. Now another term you might be familiar with for this particular technique, Dan Walsh calls it Ice Monster prologue. But there is something similar term, something around it is called the cold open. A cold open is an exciting opening sequence at the beginning of the film, or a humorous opening joke to an episode of comic series. Before the setup, the cold opening is meant to pique the audience curiosity like any other scene. Like you pick up any James Bond film and you have the perfect example of cold opening, or in other words you can say Ice Monster prologue. The opening action scene in any James Bond film is a perfect example of this, the exciting sequence that occurs before Bond receives his briefing from M. Now if you have, I have been a great fan of James Bond series, and I have seen almost all the films, unlike Sherlock Holmes also. So when you see that sort of a film, you know how this starts, and that's it, and that is called Ice Monster prologue or cold opening. Thank you very much.